Hello there, I'm Todd Weller. Thank you for joining today's Lunch and Learn served by the FileMaker team at Cross IT. Before we dig in, please remember that you have a chance to win lunch on us if you leave a comment or ask a question during the live stream. Just make sure we have your email address so we can contact you later. For today's Lunch and Learn installment, we are going to be looking at a method to use a button bar and a slide control in place of the traditional tab control object with the goal of providing a better user experience. We have a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us here today as we look at some design stuff. Last month we had started a discussion about layout design and specifically about the design tools and objects that FileMaker has given us to work with whenever we're building a layout. We have, there's a lot of, philosophical stuff that we could cover as it comes to layout design, but that's not really what we were covering. It was more about the tools that we have to use, that once we see that vision of what we want our user interface to look like, how can we make that a reality? And so we're just going to kind of continue that discussion today, looking at specifically the slide control object. Tab panels have been in the FileMaker platform for quite a long time. I didn't have a chance to double check, but I want to say it was around FileMaker 8 or maybe FileMaker 8.5 when we were introduced to the tab control object, and so it's a very common design pattern to use those. But then more recently, we've been introduced to the slide control panel, which is very helpful when you're dealing with, especially building iOS devices. People are very used to being able to swipe their finger, and so the slide control behaves in that way with the swipe gestures when you're on an iOS device. So it's a little bit more natural for the user in those circumstances. But there are ways, of course, to use this slide control panel on the desktop, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. So the question is, well, why would I want to replace a tab control panel with a slide control panel and do some other things? Well, here's an example that we have on the screen, and this is a sample database that I've used a few different times for different things, but it's just keeping track of students and staff members at a imaginary school. All the names are made up and everything, but you can see, as just here looking at these couple objects, is that on the student tab we have information specific to the student, and of course on the staff tab we are going to have information that is specific to the staff member, because there are things that you're not going to have for one that you are for the other. But then of course there's things that are going to be common to both, such as the name and the building where they are, as well as some account information for setting up Active Directory and email and all those kinds of things. But what do you do with these two tabs? Because obviously if I'm on a staff member, the student tab is empty. If I switch over to a student and look at the staff tab, that is empty. Now, it's not a big deal, but it's maybe not the best user experience, because as the user is in there working with things, and they may end up on the wrong tab for the wrong type of account, and then they put in information, and not necessarily that information is bad or it's not going to crash the system, certainly, but it's just this random bits of data that are out there floating that maybe you want to try to eliminate the possibility of that happening. And so that's where this idea of using the slide control panel with the tab control can be helpful, because what that does is it gives us the ability to then hide the individual tabs, and I use tabs in quotes because they're not really tabs. It's a slide panel now. Now there are ways to do this. I've actually used this technique way back, like FileMaker 9 or FileMaker 10, I can't recall, where you can use a script trigger that looks at a specific piece of information in the record, one field or a couple of fields, and determines, oh, it's this type of record entity rather than this, and so it can pick between two layouts that you've built with the student and account tabs, and then a second layout with the staff and account tabs. And that certainly works, but what you run into then is you are, if you have to make a change to the layout for that information that is the same, you're having to make the change 2 different places, or 3 or 4 different places, depending on the number of different layout variations that you need to show and hide the different tab control panels. And that's where using the slide control becomes a little bit easier. And so what that does is then we end up with something that looks like this. Now what I did is, because we can get lost in the minutia of setting up a layout, of making sure everything is pixel perfect, and lined and colors and all that kind of stuff. So I went ahead and built a layout here that uses that method, and then we'll kind of deconstruct it after you see what the finished product here is going to be. So here we have, this looks very similar to what we had before with the information at the top, but then we just see the two tabs. But then as I move through my records, it switches to the staff person when there's a staff member, and then switches automatically back to the student whenever I get back to a student, because again, all this information is contained in one place. All right, so how do we do that? What does that look like? All right, well, the first thing we want to do is we're going to go ahead and actually duplicate the layout. So I'm going to go ahead and get into my layout view here to manage the layouts, and I'm just going to take my original layout. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it, just drag it down here so I don't lose track of it. Go ahead and rename it, and we'll just call it that. Okay. All right, drop into layout mode and then go over to our layout that we've duplicated. And the reason why we want to do this is just because it makes it a little bit easier since we know that we have this information that's on our tab panels that we want to move to our slide controls. This way we're going to be able to just go ahead and cut and paste. So let me go ahead and zoom out just a little bit for the moment, and then we'll go ahead and select our slide control. Go ahead here and draw it. All right, make sure we're about the same width. There we go. About the same height. We want 3 panels. We'll go ahead and leave the dots showing. That's important. And then we can just go ahead and grab our objects off of our tab control. Move it on here. Switch to panel number 2. Grab the information from panel 2. Move it on over. And then finally the account tab. All right, then we'll go ahead and get rid of that object, and then we can move our tab panel here back onto our layout, and then let me zoom back in here. All right, so we've replaced our slide control or tab control panel with a slide control, which you can see was rather easily done, just to copy and paste or move things over. And we still have our dots here that help us move around, so we can get back and forth. So that's the first part, and now we just need to add our button bar object. Okay, so let's go ahead and draw that object in up here. All right, and then we'll just call that staff or student staff and account. Okay, so far things are looking good. All right, so now here is where we've got to do a little bit more work than what we would typically have to do for the tab control, because right now these are 2 separate objects. So we need to make sure that they're working together, and we're going to be going to the object, but we want to go ahead and go to the object by object name. I think we had touched on this last week, where there's pretty much the common theme when talking to FileMaker developers, that when it comes to naming objects that are on a layout, you don't name everything, you only name what you need, and this is one of those instances where we certainly want to go ahead and name them. So let's go down here. We'll take care of the tab panel first. I know there's a couple different options as far as doing the naming. The easiest way to do it is if you just come over here to your object pane on the left hand side, and then just double click into where it has the panel. Now I'm a big fan of having a prefix in front of my object name, so that if I'm looking at just a list of objects without any context, I can tell exactly what I'm looking at. So this will be, panel student. All right, so that looks good. This one here will be panel staff. All right, and you'll notice is that I selected those objects the object over here is actually changing and it's selecting that object. So this is a nice way if you're having an object that you're having trouble finding. You can get to the object listing and click on it and see what's highlighted, and so it's a very handy tool to have around. So go ahead and put in panel account here. Okay, so that takes care of our 3 slide control objects. All right, and then now we have our button bars up here. Okay, now these ones here we're also going to want to go ahead and give names to. Now for the button bar itself, we're just going to go ahead and specify button bar, and then we'll just call this student staff. And then we're going to go ahead, and even though I've labeled the individual buttons, I'm going to go ahead and give them object names under the hood. These here would be BBS for button bar segments, because that's what they call the different individual buttons that are part of your button bar as a segment. So this would be, and we're going to go ahead and use the same names, which you'll see here later on comes in handy. Okay. All right, now again, the prefixes, that's my convention. You can certainly name things however it's best for you to work with them. It's just that I have a hard time not using some type of prefix whenever I'm naming my objects. So, all right, so we've got that. So we've got our button bar, we've got our panels. All right, and so now if I just go, jump into browse mode and look at our object, obviously, the button bar, we haven't assigned it any actions, but because of the dots down here, we're still able to move back and forth, and you can see we have some slider animation that is happening that we would not have had with the button bar, or with the tab control object rather. All right, so we're getting close. All right, so let's go ahead and do a little bit more with this. Now, one of the things that you're able to do is that we're just going to go ahead and perform a single step here. All right, and just go to object, and here our object, of course, is the panel that corresponds with our button name or our tab name. So this is the student one. And this is, again, just like when you're in the script workspace, you can use the abbreviations to get to your objects and the different script steps. So this is panel staff. And then our last one is go to object. Okay, so now we've got some actions happening. All right, so what does that look like for us? Okay. All right, so now we have behavior that pretty much looks like our tab panel, except now we're using the button bar and the other slide control. But what you'll see here is we're still seeing the buttons that we don't really need to see as we move through and look at the staff, okay, which is the whole the whole goal of this exercise, right? So a little bit more to do, and that's the one thing that you're able to do with the button bar that you were not able to do with the tab control panel, and that is to set the object visibility independently of the entire object itself. All right, and so where that happens is over here on the data tab here, which is the 4th panel on the right-hand side of the pane. You can see we have behavior for hide object when. All right, so for these first 2 buttons, we're using the account type. So when the account type is not equal to student, we want to go ahead and hide that object. And then when I come to this object, it's just the opposite. All right, when the account type equals student, we want to go ahead and hide that object. All right, so let's save that and see how we did. All right, so now we're looking at okay, this is a student, so that's good. All right, when we get to the staff, we're closer because now I'm seeing just the staff and the account, tabs, if you will, at the top in our button bar, but the panel itself hasn't changed. All right, and so this is where we still need to rely on a script trigger to help us accomplish this goal. And this is going to be a layout level script trigger. All right, and so let's go ahead and go back into browse mode. All right, and so where you get to your script triggers is that here under the layout setup is that you have your script triggers that are listed for a layout. And you can see we have on record load, commit, revert, layout keystrokes, layout enter, layout exit, mode enter, mode exit, gesture tap. So there's quite a few that are layout specific, and of course the one that we want is on record load, which, there we go, it's the one at the top. Okay, and so I don't have any script triggers. Actually, I have script triggers, but we're going to go ahead and write a brand new one so that you can see all of that. But let's go ahead and we'll go to create a new one now. Call this script trigger. Call it select panel for the moment. All right, and then we can go ahead and begin building our script trigger. Now, one of the things that I do, depending on the nature of the script trigger, is that I'll actually set a global variable that allows me to bypass all of the logic that is in the script trigger, just so that I don't put myself into some kind of loop that I'm unable to get out of. And so that's what I'm going to go ahead and do here just with this first step. Is I'm just going to put an if statement that if is empty, and we'll call it trigger active. All right. And then we want to go ahead and do some stuff. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and just set our variable, which is a global. Set that to a 1. Then the last step down here that we need to do is to go ahead and clear that variable out once the logic has completed. And then go ahead and put in an exit script step just so that we have that. All right, so there's a little bit more, of course, that we need to do here to make sure that we're selecting the right object. And that comes into our if statement here, that obviously we want to do it if the script trigger is not active, but then there's also a few other things. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a underutilized function. It's called get layout object attribute. Okay, this is one that we had talked about some underutilized functions at the most recent developer group meeting here in the Pittsburgh area. And we had quite a bit of discussion about this one function specifically because there's a lot of power. It allows you to do a lot of things, but a lot of us as developers, we forget that it's there and don't realize all that it can do for us. And this is one that we want to go ahead and use here. And again, it's called get layout object attribute. If you have the time, just as an aside, we did record that meeting, so I encourage you to go and find it on the YouTube channel and check out that meeting and the discussion. Okay, and so there's a few different parameters that we're able to specify here for our get layout object attribute. And one of them, which I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put it in first, is one of the things that you can check for, as you can see, is it the front panel? Okay, so what we're able to do is by using this and then by naming our panels, which is why it's important to have those named, is that we can check to see whether any of those is the front panel. Okay, now the first one that we're going to go ahead and check for here is actually for panel for the account information. Now the reason why you want to check for this one is that if the panel is on the account panel, because that is common to all users, you don't actually have to do anything. So you only want to execute the script or the actions of the script triggered script if the account is not the front panel. Okay, now here's where things get very busy, and luckily I had done this and tested it before. and that is we want to go ahead and we want to check and see, is it the front panel a student and we're not on a student record, or is the front panel a staff record and we're not on the staff record? Okay, so just bear with me here as I go ahead and get this typed in. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cheat here and copy that. All right, so if the panel is not a student, and our count type equals student, okay, so we'll just go ahead and actually repeat that logic with a couple changes. Okay, so again, what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, the trigger is not active, our account is not the front panel, and we're either not on the student panel and it is a student record, or we're not on the staff panel and it's a staff record. Okay, so then we come in and we're going to go ahead and execute this script. All right, and then the actual command that we're going to run is very simple. It's just our go-to object. Okay, and except here we're just going to go ahead and calculate our name, which is panel underscore ampersand. And again, because we named the panels so they matched up with the account types, it will just take the account type, append it, and then we'll go ahead and go to that panel. So I think we've got everything there. So we've got our script trigger selected on record load. It's going to run in browse mode, so that's good. So we go ahead and click OK. Let's save that layout, go into browse, and see if I typed everything in correctly. Okay, so here we are. So there's a student, and we're viewing the student information, so that's good. Again, here we go to a staff record, and now we're viewing the staff information. So it looks like our script trigger is working, and then I've switched back to another student, and then now it is switched back to the student panel. If I switch over here and go to my account information and start tabbing back through, that even as I change, you'll see that the button over here on our button bar is changing. However, you know, the panel itself is not changing because, again, that account information is the same for all of our users. All right, so things are looking good. Now, the other thing that's, you know, I don't know if annoying is the right word, but you will notice that if I go ahead and move over to the staff record, okay, but then if I switch back to a student, then all of a sudden I'm not seeing the tab highlighted. Now, granted, I have this, large, font information that's kind of giving me a title of what that slide panel is, but it's not really mimicking the behavior that you would like to see from a tab control, or tab control that's going to kind of highlight which tab is the active tab. So it'd be nice if we were able to do something there as well. All right. Well, luckily we can. So let's go ahead. We'll go back into layout mode. Now here, I'm going to go ahead and select the button bar setup again. This is where we had set up the button bar. You'll notice, we can, lots of options for things that we can do here with, displaying, an icon or an icon in combination of text. We can also, calculate the name of our labels for our button bar if we want to. But then you also have the ability here to look at our active segment. Okay, and so what that does is you can select a specific segment to be the active segment, or we can go ahead and specify this. And so this here is where we can go ahead and set up a calculation. So let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and use the let function here, just so that it makes it a little bit easier to read. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to do tests to see what is the front panel, and then we can determine which segment should be the active segment. All right, so we'll just call that student is front. All right. where student is front panel. And then we'll have a test for staff is front. Okay, so we're just doing a couple quick tests to see if either one of those panels are the front panel. And then all we need to do here then is we'll just have a case statement that if the student is the front panel, we want our active segment to be our button bar segment. And then the default value will be the account tab. So let me go back and fix this because I was typing too fast. So again, we're just testing for, is the student the front panel? Is the staff the front panel? And then if it is the front panel, then we're going to go ahead and select the segment student. If the staff is the front panel, we're going to select a staff. And if not, it's going to default to the segment for the account button. All right, so let's, one more paren. There we go. All right. So we've completed our button bar setup. We can go into browse mode. And so now as we move through, you can see that now we have the highlight here that is coming up. And so that's kind of more of the behavior that our users would be expecting. And it's going to, again, provide them, the better experience. All right. So there's just a few other things that we would want to do here to match what I did. The one is, and the big one is that as long as the dots here are shown, you can still use those to look at information that you don't want your user to necessarily see. So that's kind of like the last step once you're done building, is you would just go in, select the object here. Come on, let me edit you. And of course it's not letting me get to it for some reason. There we go, our slide control setup. I don't know why that was. But one of the options with the slide control setup is, of course, you can change the size of the dots. And here you can enable or disable the swipe gestures, and you can also not show them at all. All right, so with that turned off, now it looks very much like the slide control that we had. And see, it seems to be working well. So that is the way that you go ahead and take a tab control object, convert it to a slide control and button bars, just to give your users a little bit of a better experience. Okay, so let's see if we have any questions. All right. So I guess the first obvious question that probably needs to be answered is does this mean you should never use tab control panels ever again? The answer to that is no. I'm a big fan of letting FileMaker be FileMaker. So if the tab control panel is the best tool for the job, by all means certainly go ahead and use that, because you can see there's certainly more things to do setup wise to get it to work in this method. Again, because you can probably if you don't have to worry about different types of data, you can just drop a tab control panel on your layout, start adding your objects, and everything is good to go. So by all means, yes, continue to use tab controls, but just know that this is an option when you want to put that little extra in the user interface. Okay, so another question is, are there any problems that could crop up? Okay, well, one of the problems we kind of already looked at is that, obviously if the little navigation dots, which are very common for like those slide controls for, swiping that you see on, websites and iOS apps and things like that, that if you leave those exposed, that's going to, change the behavior. Also, if it's running on an iOS device and you do have these swipe gestures enabled, the user is still going to be able to swipe to that tab panel because we've hidden it, but it's that hidden in quotes that we've done here. Because they can't get to the button to navigate to that panel. It's hidden, even though it really is still on the layout. And so that's where you can do some additional things, because there's also a slide control and tab control, like on panel switch script trigger, that you're able to look at. And if the user is trying to go to a panel that shouldn't be seen, you're able to skip over it programmatically and handle it there. But again, that's like another level of scripting that you would need to get into and testing and things like that. So that's just something there to be aware of. All right. There was also a question here about what would I personally do next. Okay, well, I'm glad you asked that question because I had originally started out working this way, but then I went ahead and changed my mind because of one of the things, and my coworker always gives me a hard time about, that I use too many custom functions. And one of the custom functions that I've worked on is one that allows me to actually get the name of the frontmost panel rather than having to test for the panels individually. So I think you all saw what we needed to do. I'll just get into the script here. You can see everything that we had to do here to test for this panel, test for that panel, all of that to see using getLayoutObject. Well, what I was able to do with my custom function was to take, get a list of all of the objects on the layout, recursively run through the test, and then just return the name of the frontmost object instead of having to test for it individually. So what that did for me is that if we look here at my button bar segment setup here under the Specify tab, you'll see that this is my my custom function, which is just get front panel, and what that does is it just then gets the name of the front panel and then substitutes the PNL prefix with the BBS prefix. Again, that's because the consistency helps in your naming conventions, whether you use mine or not. Just be consistent, and you're able to do some nice little tricks like this. So it took all of that code that we had written for the Specify button and turned it into this. The same thing in the script trigger, which this here is the the final one. You can see it simplified our calculation, where we're still checking to see whether the trigger is active. We're just making sure that the account is not the front panel, but then we could just see is the front panel minus the prefix. If it's not equal to the account type, then we want to go ahead and act on the script trigger. Okay, so that's one of the things that I would do next. Like I said, I think it was a cool custom function. I had fun putting it together, and it's already come in rather handy. So let's see, any other questions that came in while I was talking? It does not appear that there were. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Just a couple reminders of some upcoming events that we have. First, the next meeting of FMBerg, which is the Pittsburgh FileMaker Developer Group that I mentioned earlier. That takes place on Wednesday, April 6th at 6:30 p.m. This is a hybrid meeting, which means you'll have the option to attend in person or join remotely. For details and to RSVP, please visit our website at www.crossit.com, and there'll be a link to a page specific with the description and the RSVP link and all that kind of stuff. Also, at noon on Wednesday, April 20th, we are going to serve our next Lunch and Learn Entrée. As you briefly saw from today's presentation, I'm a big fan of using custom functions, and so I thought for our next Lunch and Learn, we'll just kind of give an overview of those custom functions, how do you create one, and then also the resources that are out there for finding a custom function that another developer may have already built and has shared with the community. There's a few different sites that have those kinds of things. So we'll just we'll have some fun with functions. Okay. So again, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us today. If you like what you saw and heard, please click the thumbs up and share this video. If you haven't subscribed to the Lunch and Learn information, we ask that you please do so. And you can also hit the bell in the YouTube channel to get notified when there's new content. Some of the content that's presented as part of our Lunch and Learn sessions are the result of your questions. So if you have a suggestion for a future topic, or if a specific FileMaker problem has you stumped, please submit those topics and questions by emailing us at nutshell@crossit.com. And then your idea or question may be the featured topic of a future Lunch and Learn. From all of us at Cross IT, we are glad to have served you. Have a great day.